What if Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man returned in a sequel to mourn Gwen, meet Mary Jane, and fight the Sinister Six? Or what if George Miller, the man who made the Mad Max movies, directed a Justice League movie? How about this? Imagine if Hellboy returned in a sequel to save humanity by becoming the ultimate monster he was always meant to be. Well, these are those movies that could have been. Most of these were almost made until they weren't. But each of these 10 canceled superhero movies could have been jaw-dropping to say the least. And in this video, we're going to explore everything there is to explore about these, including their current status. But before I begin, please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons. Those 2 small clicks from you can help us tremendously in bringing you more of these marvelous videos. And now let's begin. 1. Superman Lives. Nicolas Cage almost Kryptonian leapt into being the Man of Steel. Back in the mid-90s, Warner Brothers tried something that could have changed the history of DC as we know it. They wanted to make a new Superman film, grittier, weirder, and more emotionally complex, called Superman Lives, and it was set to bring the Man of Steel back to the big screen. Nicolas Cage was going to be in the cape. Directed by Tim Burton, with Kevin Smith among its writers, the film had all the ingredients for something wildly different. And yet, despite the buzz and budget, Superman Lives never got to fly. The idea was born in 1996 when Kevin Smith pitched a script based loosely on DC's The Death of Superman storyline. The project passed through multiple rewrites, shifting tones with each new version. Tim Burton signed on as director, and a 1998 release date was set. But between John Peters' obnoxious demands, like Superman not flying, and rising production costs, the film spiraled into development hell. Scripts kept changing, concept art kept piling up, and the studio kept bleeding money. Roughly $30 million by the time they pulled the plug in 2002. Cage's Superman was supposed to reflect some serious alienation of a Kal-El raised on Earth without guidance, someone who is constantly haunted by his own origins. Cage even shot screen tests in the Superman suit. Dan Gilroy's version of the script leaned into that emotional tension and positioned Superman as a reluctant savior, not the clean-cut Boy Scout full of righteousness 100 times more than Captain America. Whether it would have worked or flopped is anyone's guess, but it would have been a take like no other. The story also planned to pit Superman against villains like Brainiac, Lex Luthor, and a newly created Doomsday, who found their place in the script. Brainiac would have blocked the sun to strip Superman of his powers. Lex would have teamed up with him to form Lexiac. Yes, that was the name. And then there was Doomsday, their engineered enforcer, meant to land the final blow on Superman and kill him. Smith wanted Michael Rooker as Lex, while Christopher Walken was rumored for Brainiac. The film even had Chris Rock locked in as Jimmy Olsen and Sandra Bullock eyed for Lois Lane, and Ben Affleck floated as a Superman backup. Wardrobe fittings were done, model sets built, and marketing gear set in motion, and then nothing. Years later, Cage finally got his Kryptonian moment in The Flash from 2023, in which he appeared briefly in the multiverse, battling a giant spider, a nod to one of John Peters' wildest production ideas. However, this was all CGI, and Nicolas Cage never really arrived to shoot this scene. 2. Spider-Man 4, Sam Raimi's Unfinished Symphony. Sam Raimi's Spider-Man 4 had all the makings of a strong comeback. After the mixed reception of Spider-Man 3, Raimi was determined to end the Tobey Maguire saga on a high note. The film was in active development, had a star-stacked cast lined up, villains prepped, and storyboards ready. But Sony pulled the plug before cameras could roll, and the franchise pivoted to a reboot instead with The Amazing Spider-Man. The 4th installment aimed to double down on what made the first 2 films work. Stuff like character-driven storytelling, grounded stakes, and a dash of Raimi's signature movie-making style. Raimi wanted to redeem himself after Spider-Man 3, which had suffered from studio interference, specifically the forced inclusion of Venom. To avoid that again, he insisted on full creative control for Spider-Man 4. But as the script revisions dragged on and deadlines knocked on the door, he chose to walk rather than repeat past mistakes. Tobey Maguire, Kirsten Dunst, West, J.K. Simmons, and Bryce Dallas Howard were all set to return. New faces would have joined too. John Malkovich had signed on as Adrian Toomes, aka the Vulture. Dylan Baker was finally set to transform into the Lizard after 2 films as Dr. Kurt Connors. Anne Hathaway was also in talks to play Felicia Hardy, not as Vulturess, as was rumored, but as Black Cat, partnering with Spider-Man instead of fighting him. Storyboard artist Jeffrey Henderson later revealed Raimi's Vulture would have leaned into horror, similar to Doc Ock's terrifying debut in Spider-Man 2. Practical effects, grim design, and grounded brutality were the tone. The final battle would have nearly killed Peter, only for him to rip apart the Vulture's wings and survive. Raimi also planned to tease Vulturess as a potential threat for Spider-Man 5, possibly played by Angelina Jolie. While the exact plot remains unclear, it likely followed Peter still reeling from Harry Osborn's death and struggling with his relationship with Mary Jane. Raimi aimed to tell a story that balanced grief, love, and responsibility while pushing Spider-Man into his most emotionally charged conflict yet. When Spider-Man No Way Home brought Maguire back, it rekindled fan interest in this abandoned project. Raimi has since said he'd return if the story felt right, and Maguire echoed the same. For now, Spider-Man 4 remains one of the most fleshed-out superhero films to never get made. All the parts were there: the director, the cast, the arc, but in the end, the web never connected. 3. X-Men Origins: Magneto, the villain's journey. Before the X-Men franchise spiraled into prequel fatigue, X-Men Origins Magneto was lined up to explore the history of Eric Lehnsherr. Not the supervillain with the helmet and one-liners, but the boy torn from his family during World War II. The idea was simply to tell Magneto's story from the beginning and show how he became one of Marvel's most compelling characters. The pitch came from screenwriter Sheldon Turner, who described it as the pianist but with mutants. The concept had weight. The first X-Men movie opens with a young Eric watching his parents get dragged away by Nazi soldiers. In that moment of rage and fear, his power to control metal comes to life. That single scene set the tone for what Magneto could have been: a war-torn, character-driven drama set in a world that would eventually birth the X-Men. Turner's script reportedly explored Eric's escape from the camp, his early quest for revenge, and his growing distrust of humanity. At some point, it would have shown his first encounter with Charles Xavier, laying the foundation for their future camaraderie as well as the split. David S. Goyer came on board to direct, and Ian McKellen was attached, at least for framing scenes or flash forwards. But with Magneto being in his 20s for most of the story, a younger actor was expected to take over the role. Around 2007, the project seemed like it was moving forward until it wasn't. The biggest hit came from within. X-Men Origins Wolverine was released in 2009 and failed to impress. Critics disliked it. Fans hated it. Even though it made money, it underperformed. The title brand took a blow, and with it, Magneto was quietly shelved. The 2007 to 2008 Writers Guild strike didn't help either, stalling rewrites and locking the film in development limbo. Instead, parts of Magneto were folded into X-Men First Class. The younger version of Eric, played by Michael Fassbender, stole the show. Scenes of revenge, war trauma, and his early bond with Xavier all echoed what Origins Magneto had in mind. First Class didn't tell everything Turner had written, but it salvaged the heart of the project. 4. Justice League Mortal: George Miller's lost epic that never was. Before Zack Snyder's Justice League and the wave of multiverse reboots, George Miller had his own plans for the DC universe. Justice League Mortal was already in pre-production when Warner Brothers pulled the plug, and what could have been a game-changing superhero epic vanished. The idea came together back in 2007, when DC's cinematic slate was still in flux. Batman Begins had done well, Superman Returns had underwhelmed, and Marvel hadn't yet reshaped the genre with Iron Man. Miller was tapped to direct Justice League Mortal, a massive ensemble film that aimed to introduce the League all at once with a fresh, younger cast. The script, written by Michelle and Kieran Mulroney, mixed several comic arcs, including Tower of Babel and Crisis on Infinite Earths. Batman, more paranoid than usual, had built a surveillance program, Brother Eye, to monitor superpowered beings. But things went south when the villain Maxwell Lord hijacked the system and used it to unleash havoc. He manipulated Superman, turned him against the League, and weaponized fear across the board. The Flash would have been an important character and was supposed to ultimately sacrifice himself to save the team. Lord's death came halfway through the story, but his mind lived on inside a supercomputer, continuing to wreak havoc. The casting went in a different direction than fans might expect. Rather than bring in Christian Bale or Brandon Routh, Miller opted for new faces. Armie Hammer as Batman, DJ Catrona as Superman, Megan Gale as Wonder Woman, Common as Green Lantern, Adam Brody as Flash, Santiago Cabrera as Aquaman, and Hugh Keys Byrne as Martian Manhunter. With Weta Workshop handling costumes and VFX design, the groundwork was already in motion. Photos of Gale's Wonder Woman suit surfaced years later, and Hammer once described his Batman costume as both high-tech and handmade, with Italian leather detailing and forearm tools. But then came the roadblocks. The Writers Guild strike stalled production. Christian Bale publicly distanced his version of Batman from this new project. And worse, Australia, where Miller had planned to film, revoked a tax rebate that would have covered a large chunk of the budget. Warner Brothers grew hesitant, unsure about the dual Batman situation and whether audiences would buy in. Eventually, with rising costs and shaky internal confidence, the project was shelved. Miller later said the studio started leaning toward bigger stars, and his younger cast no longer fit the plan. What he envisioned was something operatic, a superhero myth rooted in morality, power, and legacy. In the end, the world got Fury Road, but Justice League Mortal stayed buried, surviving only in concept art, cast memories, and a documentary that's still unreleased. Of all the movies in this list, this is something I would have loved to watch. 5. Channing Tatum's Gambit movie, the card trick that never landed. Back in 2014, Channing Tatum was announced as Remy LeBeau, aka Gambit. Fans were skeptical, but Tatum, well, he was all in. He loved the character, he had the Cajun roots, and he brought major star power. At a time when Fox was still riding the Days of Future Past high and planning to expand the X-Men universe, Gambit looked like it could be the next solo success story. But after years of rewrites, director swaps, and studio shakeups, the film fizzled out before it could shoot a single scene. Tatum's Gambit film was supposed to reset the character's image after X-Men Origins Wolverine gave him a forgettable debut played by Taylor Kitsch. That version didn't stick, but Tatum's take promised something new. He wanted to show Gambit's charisma, his flair, and his backstory, specifically the Thieves and Assassins Guilds of New Orleans. Rupert Wyatt, of Rise of the Planet of the Apes, was first brought on to direct. He left after budget disagreements. Doug Liman came aboard for a while, then left too. Gore Verbinski signed up next, and yes, he left as well. With each new director came a different vision and more delays. The cast started to fill out. Léa Seydoux was cast as Belladonna Boudreaux, Gambit's childhood love turned rival. Mr. Sinister was tapped as the villain. The setting would have been Louisiana, which would have placed the film in Remy's home turf. Producer Simon Kinberg described the tone as a mix of a heist movie and a romantic comedy. Less traditional superhero action, more character-driven chaos. The film was even planned as R-rated, meant to showcase Gambit's rogue lifestyle without pulling punches. Then came the Disney buyout of Fox in 2019. With Kevin Feige now calling the shots for the X-Men's future, Gambit quietly slipped off the slate. Tatum later said the project got swallowed up in the merger. He kept calling Marvel for updates, but eventually even he admitted he had to let it go, emotionally and mentally. He described it as a heartbreak, saying the film would have been a weird, genre-bending love story with real heart. Years later, Tatum finally got his moment. In Deadpool and Wolverine, he appeared in full Gambit gear, accent, cards, and all. It was short but packed with energy, poking fun at how long it took for him to wear the trench coat. Whether he gets another shot is unknown, but for a few scenes, Channing Tatum's Gambit finally existed, and that alone made it worth the wait. 6. The Amazing Spider-Man 3. After The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was released in 2014, Sony was already hyping up a full-blown Spider-Verse. The Amazing Spider-Man 3 was penciled in for a 2016 release. Sinister VI and Venom spin-offs were in the works. Andrew Garfield's version of Peter Parker was supposed to be the anchor, but things didn't go as planned. While The Amazing Spider-Man 2 pulled in decent numbers at the international box office, critics and audiences were divided. That wasn't what derailed the third film, film, though. The real reason was a behind-the-scenes fallout that shut the door on Garfield's run. Leading up to The Amazing Spider-Man 3, Sony had prepared a major announcement for a press event in Rio during the World Cup. Garfield was expected to appear on stage with then-CEO Kaz Hirai to confirm the sequel and show confidence in the franchise. But Garfield backed out. He wasn't feeling well, according to his team. Sony executives didn't take it lightly. Hirai reportedly saw it as a personal snub. Internally, the studio decided to cut ties, and the press event's centerpiece was scrapped at the last minute. Garfield's performance wasn't the issue. If anything, his take on Peter Parker had heart. He brought awkward charm and juvenile emotion, and even when the scripts got weak, he carried it with honesty. But skipping that event turned out to be a disaster. Sony shelved The Amazing Spider-Man 3 and pivoted to talks with Marvel about rebooting the character for the MCU. Within 2 years, Tom Holland was cast, and Garfield was out. What makes this sting more is how close The Amazing Spider-Man 3 came to being real. The story would have picked up with Peter grieving Gwen's death, and rumors pointed to Oscorp experimenting with resurrection tech. Sinister VI was set up. The groundwork was there. Dylan Baker's Dr. Kurt Connors might have returned. Mary Jane had already been cast. In fact, Shailene Woodley filmed scenes that never made it to the final cut of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. The franchise was building towards something, and it just stopped. After Spider-Man No Way Home, Garfield got a second win. Fans embraced him like never before. He nailed every scene, reminded people why his Spider-Man mattered, and instantly sparked talk of The Amazing Spider-Man 3 again. Sony hasn't made it official, but if any version of Spidey deserves another shot, it's his. The heart's still there. The world's finally ready. Now it's just a question of whether the studio will pick up that thread and let him swing again. 7. Hellboy III, Del Toro's unfinished trilogy. After Hellboy II: The Golden Army hit theaters in 2008, Guillermo del Toro had one last story in mind to close out the trilogy. He called it tragic, theatrical, and massive in scale. Ron Perlman was on board, and everything was ready to lift off. And for years, fans held on to hope. But with the announcement of a full reboot led by Neil Marshall and starring David Harbour, that chapter officially ended. Hellboy III, the one that would have turned Red into the Beast of the Apocalypse, was never made. Del Toro had the idea in his mind for quite a while. You see, back in 2008, he said he wanted the final chapter to be bittersweet and full of otherworldly consequences. Hellboy would face his fate and become the monster he was always meant to be. The film would have seen him accept his destiny to save humanity, but in doing so, he'd turn into something darker. The world would survive, but not without cost. As Del Toro described it, the third film would have been an end-of-days finale, full of gods, oracles, and destruction. Perlman called the pitch epic and said it would need to be twice as big as the last two combined. The actor pushed for it at cons, in interviews, and on social media. Del Toro reciprocated that energy. At one point in 2012, both claimed they were trying to make it happen, but the clock kept ticking. Del Toro kept stacking up other projects, and by 2014, the chances started slipping. During a Reddit Ask Me Anything that year, he said the sequel was unlikely. Then, in 2017, he confirmed it. 100% the sequel will not happen. Why? Mostly money. The first two Hellboy films made modest profits and did well on DVD, but studios weren't convinced a third could break out, especially with Del Toro aiming for something massive in scope. The home video market wasn't what it used to be, and that hurt the pitch. Every studio passed. Del Toro said they went through basically every studio looking for financing. No one agreed. Mignola moved forward with a reboot instead. While he never stated a reason publicly, his earlier comments suggested concern about Del Toro's packed schedule, so the creative team reset. Del Toro and Perlman were out. Harbour came in, and the version of Hellboy 3 where Red embraces his demonic legacy never made it past the drawing board. 8. Batman, Year One, Aronofsky's Dark Vision. In the early 2000s, Warner Brothers wanted to bring Batman back. After the fallout from Batman and Robin, the studio scrambled to relaunch the character without the camp. That led to Darren Aronofsky, an indie director, gaining traction with films like Pi and Requiem for a Dream. Aronofsky pitched something stripped down and brutal, a street-level reinvention that tossed out the playbook. To seal the deal, he brought on comic book legend Frank Miller to help him adapt Batman Year One, but with serious deviations from canon. The project wasn't a sequel, it was a total reset. Bruce Wayne still lost his parents in Crime Alley, but there was no Alfred, no mansion, no fortune. Wayne Enterprises cast him aside, and Bruce landed in the system. He escaped and got taken in by Big Al. A grizzled mechanic raised him in a garage. Instead of ninja training, Bruce learned to fix cars and survive in a corrupt world. When Big Al was gunned down, Bruce snapped and built his own tools to take Gotham back. This version of Batman was less martial artist and more street brawler. He operated out of the auto shop, wore a stitched-together suit, and drove a modified Lincoln Continental as the Batmobile. He still faced the Falcone crime family, but the tone leaned heavily into urban decay, not theatrical villains or gadgets. Sounds interesting, to be honest. Aronofsky wanted Joaquin Phoenix to play his Batman, which is pretty crazy since he later played Joker. Warner had other ideas. They preferred someone more traditionally heroic, like Freddie Prinze Jr. The disconnect only widened from there. Although the project reached early development, suit designs, early storyboards, and script drafts were in motion, momentum stalled. At the same time, Warner was juggling multiple projects. Their Superman reboot with Tim Burton had already burned through $30 million, as I mentioned earlier, and fizzled out. They flirted with a Batman vs. Superman film with Wolfgang Peterson directing and Colin Farrell as Batman, but that also lost steam. Eventually, Christopher Nolan pitched his take on Batman, a grounded reboot that clicked with the studio immediately. That became Batman Begins, and Aronofsky's vision was shelved. Looking back, his Year One pitch would have been something else entirely. Bleak, gritty, and stripped of superhero gloss. Aronofsky himself later said it resembled Taxi Driver more than a comic book movie. While we'll never see it on screen, his scrapped Batman story still stands as one of the more fascinating near misses in superhero film history. A version that could have taken The Dark Knight to places the genre hadn't dared to go. 9. Man of Steel 2. When Man of Steel hit theaters in 2013, it was meant to reboot Superman for a new generation. Zack Snyder gave audiences a more serious, introspective Kal-El, played by Henry Cavill. The film had its share of supporters and detractors, but there was no denying its ambition. Yet despite laying the groundwork for a modern Superman franchise, Man of Steel never got a sequel. Cavill's Superman appeared 3 more times, but Warner Brothers never followed up with a proper Part 2. Cavill's Superman would next appear in Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice, a crossover that jumped straight into world building. That decision pulled focus away from Clark Kent's personal journey and shifted the spotlight to bigger ensemble stories. By the time Justice League came around, Superman wasn't even present for half the film. His resurrection barely got time to breathe. Cavill kept showing up, but his Superman started to feel like a supporting character in his own universe. The years that followed brought more confusion. Rumors swirled. Cameos were teased, only to be swapped out for faceless stand-ins in projects like Shazam and Peacemaker. According to reports, contract negotiations were often to blame. Cavill was supposedly in talks for more appearances, but things stalled. Still, his name never left the conversation. Fans rallied for his return. Directors pitched ideas. Matthew Vaughn, Andy Muschietti, and Christopher McQuarrie all had different visions for a sequel. None moved forward. At one point, Peaky Blinders creator Stephen Knight even delivered a script treatment with Brainiac as the villain. The studio passed. Cavill finally showed up again in Black Adam, promising a return in a post-credits cameo. He posted an official announcement on social media, but just weeks later, DC was restructured. James Gunn and Peter Safran took over as heads of DC Studios. And the plan changed fast. Gunn had already been developing his own Superman story, one focused on a younger Clark Kent. The studio opted for a soft reboot. Legacy characters would be recast. Cavill was out. Despite his return being teased, the window had closed. Cavill confirmed it himself, thanking fans and bowing out. Man of Steel 2 was never greenlit. It floated in limbo for years, always rumored, never real. What we lost wasn't just a sequel, it was a chance to let Cavill's Superman grow into the role. Instead, his version remained frozen in place, caught between starts and studio shakeups. Now, James Gunn's Superman aims to start fresh. Whether it can capture the magic Cavill never got to fully explore remains to be seen. 10. Sinister VI, Spider-Man's Villains Unite. Before Spider-Man found his footing in the MCU, Sony had plans of its own. After The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was released in 2014, the studio lined up a Sinister VI spin-off to build its own cinematic universe around Andrew Garfield's version of Peter Parker. Drew Goddard was hired to write and direct. The project had momentum, then disappeared. According to MCU, The Reign of Marvel Studios, Goddard's script didn't play it safe. The story took Spider-Man and the villains to the Savage Land, a hidden prehistoric jungle. One scene even had Spidey riding a T-Rex. The plot also included breaches in space-time and global set pieces across Paris and London. Sony wanted this to feel big. The core villain lineup included Dr. Octopus, Vulture, Mysterio, Sandman, Black Cat, and possibly Spider-Man himself. Emails leaked in the 2014 Sony hack named actors like Matt Damon, Idris Elba, Bryan Cranston, and Jackie Chan as casting ideas. The film's main threat would have been Gog, a monster from another dimension that Doc Ock intended to recruit. But when Sony joined forces with Marvel Studios to reboot the character, Sinister VI was shelved. Still, the studio didn't forget. It avoided 6 villains in No Way Home, possibly saving the name for later. If it happens, Tom Holland's Spider-Man may face the 6 next. And maybe, just maybe, the Savage Land still has a future in the MCU. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, be safe. Thanks everyone.